room didn't laugh after his joke, not because it wasn't funny, but because it landed too close to the truth. And everyone felt it at the same time, like a glass dropped in a silent hall. And Mark instantly regretted opening his mouth, wishing he could pull the words back. But his boss, Miss Evelyn Carter, didn't smile or frown. She simply leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. And in that pause, Mark's mind raced to Lily waiting at home, probably asleep with her math book still open, probably dreaming that her dad wasn't always late and tired, probably believing he was stronger than he felt right now. And the silence stretched until Mark cleared his throat and added softly, "I'm sorry, that was a bad joke." But Evelyn raised a hand, stopping him, and said calmly, "No, Mr. Harris, it wasn't." And that was somehow worse, because she stood up, walked to the window overlooking the city, and said without turning around, "Do you know why I asked you to stay tonight?" And Mark shook his head even though she couldn't see it, and she continued, "Because I've watched you for 3 years come in early, leave late, skip lunches, refuse promotions that required travel, and never once complain." And Mark felt heat rise in his face, because he had complained, just not out loud, not where it mattered, not where it could cost him his job. And she turned to face him then, eyes softer now but still sharp, and said, "Your joke wasn't about staying the night. It was about fear." And that word hit him harder than any insult ever had, because it was true. And suddenly he was talking before he could stop himself, telling her about the daycare fines, the school calls, the nights he slept in his car during Lily's hospital stay because parking was too expensive, the way he pretended everything was fine because a single dad with excuses is just a liability in corporate language. And he didn't notice tears forming until one fell on the carpet, and he froze, embarrassed, ready to apologize again. But instead Evelyn did something unexpected. She sat down across from him, not behind the desk, but beside it, equal height, equal space, and said quietly, "My father raised me alone." And the room changed, the walls less cold, the air less sharp. And she told him about sleeping under her dad's desk while he worked night shifts, about the jokes he made to hide exhaustion, about how one decision from a boss once changed everything for them. And Mark listened like someone finally speaking his language. And when she asked, "If I offered you flexibility, real flexibility, would you stay?" he didn't answer right away because he'd learned offers often came with invisible costs. But when she added, "And if I offered growth that doesn't punish your parenthood?" something in him cracked open, hope creeping in, despite years of training himself not to expect it. And the chapter closed with Evelyn saying, "Go home tonight, Mr. Harris, be with your daughter." And as he stood to leave, she added, "Tomorrow we rewrite the rules." And Mark walked out into the night, not knowing that the joke he'd made out of desperation had just shifted the direction of his life. And if you're watching this story unfold and you believe one small moment can change everything, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the bravest thing a single parent can do is speak the truth, even when it sounds like a joke. The next morning felt different before Mark even reached the office. Not because the city had changed or the traffic had eased, but because for the first time in years he walked in without that familiar knot in his stomach. Lily's hug from the night before still lingering in his arms, after he'd surprised her by being home early, helped her with homework, cooked a messy dinner they laughed over, and tucked her in while she asked, half asleep, "Did you get in trouble for your joke, Dad?" And he'd smiled and said, "Maybe I finally told the truth," not knowing how prophetic that answer would be, because when he stepped onto the office floor, the whispers followed him. Co-workers glancing up from their screens, some curious, some sympathetic, some jealous, all of them sensing something had shifted. And when Evelyn Carter called a department-wide meeting within the hour, the tension tightened like a drawn bow. People expecting layoffs or another efficiency lecture. But instead, she stood at the front of the room and spoke about performance, loyalty, and the invisible cost of pretending personal lives don't exist. And then, without naming. Mark at first, she told a story about a single parent who had given everything to his job, while being afraid to ask for anything in return, and Mark felt every sentence land like a spotlight, his hands sweating as she finally looked directly at him and said, "Yesterday, someone reminded me that leadership isn't tested by profits alone, but by how we treat the people who make them possible." And then she announced a pilot program, flexible hours, remote days, on-site childcare partnerships, promotion paths redesigned for parents, and the room erupted, disbelief buzzing louder than applause. And Mark sat frozen as she added, "And the person who inspired this will be leading its implementation," because suddenly every eye turned to him. The single dad with the bad joke, the man who used to eat lunch alone at his desk, now standing on shaky legs as Evelyn nodded at him with quiet confidence. And in that moment, Mark realized this wasn't charity, it was trust. And trust was heavier than fear, but far more powerful. And the weeks that followed were a blur of late nights that no longer felt like punishment. Meetings where his ideas were finally heard. Lily visiting the office on open days and proudly telling anyone who'd listen, "My dad helped change the rules." And the biggest surprise came months later when Evelyn offered him a senior role, not as a reward for sacrifice, but for results. And he accepted without guilt, without jokes to deflect, because he had learned something vital. Honesty wasn't weakness, it was leverage. And on the night of his promotion dinner, as Lily raised her glass of soda and said to Dad, for not being scared anymore, Mark felt tears rise again. But this time they came with peace, knowing one moment of truth had rewritten not just his career, but his daughter's future. And if this story moved you, if you believe that even a small joke, spoken from exhaustion, can open the door to real change, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that courage doesn't always sound brave, sometimes it just sounds honest.